any second. All right. Well, good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants event. My name is Joe Grabowski, and I'll be your host for today. Really excited to be looking at YouTube right now and seeing all the numbers starting to climb of people joining us from their homes, from across Canada, from across North America. Great to have everybody joining in, and it's great to be able to still interact in this way, to still be able to run these events with amazing scientists, explorers, adventurers, and conservationists from all around the world, but this time beaming them directly into your homes. So we're really excited for today's event. Today, we're going to spend a little time hanging out with Dave Williams. But before I introduce Dave, we're going to do things just a little bit different today. So in the chat sidebar, I am sharing a link right now. So this link is to something called Slido. If you go to this link, you'll see a spot for a meeting number. Or meeting ID. And if you put Astro Dave as the ID there, that's going to let you join in, send in some questions there as well. And then we're going to do a couple little poll questions during the event as well. So you can check out what we've got going on there and take part in those poll questions. It should be a lot of fun. All right, well, let's jump over now and meet Dave. So Dave was an emergency physician before the Canadian Space Agency selected him as one of 4 successful candidates out of a field of more than 5,000 applicants to begin astronaut training in 1992. So he completed basic training, and in May 1993 was appointed the manager of the Missions and Space Medicine Group within the Canadian Astronaut Program. He's flown on 2 space shuttle missions, visited the International Space Station, and spent 17 hours and 47 minutes on 3 spacewalks. He's also, in 2001, became an aquanaut through his participation in the NASA-NOAA joint mission, NEMO-1. And so spending time 7 days underwater at the Aquarius Reef Base, the only underwater research laboratory in the world. He became the first Canadian to have lived and worked both in space and in our ocean. So Dave, it's so awesome to have you joining us live today. We're excited to get to know you a little bit better. And of course, we'll have just a pile of questions for you as well.
Well, thanks very much, Joe. I'm really thrilled to be here today, and I hope everybody's well and that you're at home, you're able to do your hand hygiene and not touch your face and all that good stuff. But I could just as easily be aboard the International Space Station, looking out the window in the cupola and seeing a view like this that we saw all the time on my last spaceflight, STS-118. It was a remarkable experience. And Joe, you're very gracious with your introduction. When I applied in 1992, we did have a lot of applicants. There were over 5,000 applicants, but the important message is we had 600 applications from kids less than 10 years of age. So there's nothing wrong in getting those applications in early. And in fact, if you're dreaming about becoming an astronaut, the message of today's presentation is keep that dream alive, and you never really know how things are going to work out. So I have a presentation that I put together on PowerPoint that we can show you through this remarkable technology we have. And I thought we'd start off with that, and then we'll open it up for some questions, and you can ask any question about what it's like living and working in space or living and working underwater, whatever people are interested in. Is that okay, Joe, if we go over to the presentation?
That sounds perfect to me, Dave.
Excellent. All right, so with the marvel of modern technology, here we go. We'll bring it up and we'll get started. So I was a little kid growing up in Canada in the 1960s. Of course, that was a while ago when I first dreamt of becoming an astronaut. And the story that I have is very much aligned with what it was like in those days becoming an astronaut, you know, being able to see a view like this, looking out the window at the remarkable beauty of space. And one of the things that's really characteristic of being in space is when you see the Earth from such a unique perspective, there's no borders that are evident separating countries. And you realize that, in fact, we're all in this together. It's a remarkable time for everybody to be able to see images like that. Of course, I was a little kid, you know, growing up on the West Island of Montreal, dreaming about becoming an astronaut. But I was always really curious about science and how science would play into my future. So I was very passionate about this. I had a chemistry set at home. I had an electronic engineering set that I used to make a radio, in fact, and I was able to listen to that late at night. But I was also really interested in in flying airplanes. And that passion started when I was very young. And I started off with balsa wood airplanes, went from there to things that were a little bit bigger. I had to build them myself with rubber band engines and things. And then all of a sudden, I was able to get this P-40 Warhawk for my birthday. It's a Cox gas-powered airplane that you fly on a control line. So you're spinning around and around in a circle. And the biggest challenge that I had with this airplane was trying not to get dizzy and fall over. But I was told as a kid that I couldn't become an astronaut. And when I asked why, I was told, well, because Canada doesn't have an astronaut program. In the 1960s, the only countries flying humans in space were the United States and Russia. So I thought, if I can't become an astronaut and go to space, I want to become an aquanaut, live and work underwater like Jacques Cousteau and all the famous exploits of the divers of the day. So I started scuba diving when I was 12, and then towards the end of 1968, we watched the crew of Apollo 8 go to the moon, an absolutely remarkable time that captured the imagination of everybody that watched that event. It was the first time in history that humans saw an Earthrise from the moon. And this photograph is arguably amongst one of the most commonly reproduced photographs in the history of the human species. It gives us this unique perspective of our planet, this beautiful blue oasis in space cast against the black infinite void of space. It was truly remarkable. Getting ready, of course, for those Apollo 11 lunar landings on the surface of the moon. Just last year, we celebrated the 50th anniversary of Apollo 11, and I can remember as a 13-year-old watching it on television. And of course, in those days, we didn't have color TVs. It was a little black and white TV that we watched the grainy images of Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin walking on the surface of the moon. But it was remarkable nonetheless. It was absolutely incredible being able to see something like that happen. And certainly for me, again, it just galvanized that dream of wanting to become an astronaut, getting a chance to fly in space. So I started university at McGill University in 1971. I was there for 12 years because I was really passionate about learning all about the body, human physiology, how the brain worked, and ultimately I wanted to be a doctor, hoping one day to be a doctor in space. In those days, the university was typically a different environment than it was today. And fortunately, I was able, after 12 years, to go through this whole process, become an emergency physician, and work as a trauma team leader at Sunnybrook Health Sciences Center in Toronto before I joined the space program in 1992. So this is the type of environment that we'd be working in the trauma room, and there's nothing that I haven't seen as an emergency physician. And of course, in today's world, with all the challenges we're experiencing with COVID-19, my thoughts are with all of my healthcare professional colleagues who are working tirelessly right now in hospitals throughout the world to keep all of us well and to keep all of us safe. I started flying in the late 1980s. I actually started in 1971, but I ran out of money. I just couldn't afford to be able to pay to have my tuition for university and then pay to be able to go and fly. So I stopped and then started again in the mid 1980s, got my private pilot's license before I joined the space program. And then as an astronaut, trained to become a commercial multi-engine instrument rated pilot. But in 1995, I was sent down to NASA and we got a chance to train as an astronaut candidate, affectionately known as ASCANs. And this picture was taken in the back of the KC-135, the Vomit Comet, where we do these parabolic arcs in the air, flying with the airplane 45 degrees, nose up, and then they push the nose of the airplane forward, and you literally fall out of the sky. And inside the airplane, you're just floating around like you would be in space. As a physician in space, it was interesting because I had a chance to experience the changes that took place in my own body. And that's something that we can talk about afterwards in the question period, but I tried to capture that in my book, To Burp or Not to Burp. My first space flight was in 1998, dedicated to understanding how the brain and nervous system adapted to being in space. But of course, when you're training to go in space, you have to have fun doing this. And we were thrilled to be able to go to Hollywood, get a tour with Steven Spielberg, get on the set of Star Trek, and get our pictures taken in those uniforms. It was a pretty amazing moment for the crew. When you get to space, there is no up and there is no down. In this case, that's me in the upper right-hand corner with my mustache back in 1998. And I'm looking at you from a position where I'd see you as being upside down. You see me as being upside down, but in fact, where you are in space is based on the orientation of your head. So in this case, I would be looking through a camera, an image, and I'd say, everybody else is upside down. I'm the one that's really right side up, which is kind of a fun thing to do. We did some experiments looking at how our brain waves changed when we were in space, how our sleeping patterns changed, how our body adapted to this unique environment. But more importantly, we had a chance to look at the Earth and see the fact that it's really covered by oceans. 70% of the surface area of the Earth is covered by oceans. So we recognize the opportunity to live underwater and do research underwater that would help us one day in space. So in 2006, I had a chance to do my second underwater mission called Nemo 9, where we're evaluating remote medical procedures and telerobotic surgery. And this time, unlike the diving equipment I wore when I was 12 years old, we had really more complex diving equipment. But the funny part about this is when I was 12 years old, I dreamt of becoming an astronaut. And ironically, I became an astronaut before I became an aquanaut. And I had a chance to fly in space before I lived underwater. So it was kind of fun. Living on the undersea habitat, it's a remarkable structure. The habitat's called Aquarius, and it's located off the coast of Key Largo, Florida, in the Florida Keys. At a depth of around 60 feet is where the bottom is. The entrance to the habitat's at a depth of around 40 feet. And you swim into the habitat through what we call the wet porch. It's just this virtual door with the pressure in the habitat keeping the water outside the habitat. You stick your head up inside the entry porch and you can breathe the air inside the habitat without any problem at all. And that's a great picture of the crew of Nemo 9, Tim Broderick, Nicole Stott, Ron Garin, and myself. We had an amazing time living underwater for 18 days. Those lessons that we learned helped get us ready for the International Space Station. My second space flight in 2007, working together in space with an amazing crew, our commander in the center, Scott Kelly, who ultimately went on to spend a year in space. But our job as a crew was to be able to build and maintain the space station. So I had a chance to do 3 spacewalks, setting the Canadian record for spacewalks. And we trained to be able to do that underwater at the NBL, called the Neutral Buoyancy Laboratory at Johnson Space Center. About a year and a half, 2 years after training, we get ready for liftoff. The night before liftoff, you're walking around the base of the orbiter, this amazing view of the vehicle. And then, of course, the day of liftoff, you're strapped into the vehicle. And, you know, at the time T0, the solid rocket boosters ignite. There's no question in your mind you're going someplace really fast. Well, in our case, on flight day 3, we rendezvoused and docked with the International Space Station. And you have to remember, we're traveling 25 times the speed of sound. That's 8 kilometers a second or 5 miles a second. We're traveling roughly 8 times faster than a rifle bullet. It's incredible. So needless to say, the docking has to be a slow and controlled experience as we come together, the space shuttle and the space station. My job was to bring the spacesuits over to the space station to get ready for the first spacewalk. Rick and I went outside on that spacewalk. We installed S5, the starboard truss element, the 5th truss element on the starboard side of the space station. And then on my second spacewalk, I had a chance to ride on the end of the Canadarm. Pretty proud moment for me as a Canadian astronaut with the Canadian flag on my shoulder, riding on the end of the Canadarm. Scott Kelly took this great picture when I was working at the US lab on the last spacewalk with Clay Anderson. And at that point, we had a chance to see the moon rising up over the Earth's horizon, an absolutely spectacular view. I tried to capture all of this in my memoir. It's a book called Defying Limits, but that really wasn't how I started writing books. I started writing books because I wanted to create books that were written for children to try and capture their imagination in science and technology, engineering and math, and all those things that we use when we're out in space. So the first one was called To Burp or Not to Burp, a very important question when you're in space. Second one, Go for Liftoff, is how we train like an astronaut. It's what you do when you don't succeed that ultimately determines if you will succeed. Mighty Mission Machines talks about all those things that we work with, and Destination Space is really cool. It's just about living on other planets in our solar system, whether that's going back to the moon or on to Mars or farther out in our solar system. If you're interested in living on another planet, all the answers are in Destination Space. So I've been very lucky throughout the course of my career to have a chance to do all these different things, living in space, living and working underwater, working as an emergency physician, and now today being able to write books and share these experiences with others to try and capture the imagination of the next generation. I think it's really neat to think that somebody who's watching this today could be the next generation of human space explorers that's going to walk on the surface of Mars. And that's absolutely incredible. So I say go for it. So back to you, Joe. I think it's been a great opportunity to share some experiences. Looking forward to some questions.
All right. Awesome, Dave. Thanks so much for sharing with us. And I can see we've got a great group tuning in via YouTube right now, and groups are already starting to introduce themselves. So keep introducing yourself in that chat sidebar and send us in some questions. And then we're also using the Slido app today. So I know that there's some logged in right now using it. And Dave, our first poll, I put up a question a little bit earlier asking the groups joining, would you travel to space if given the opportunity? And right now we have a 63% yes and a 37% no split. So that changed from 50-50 at the beginning of the call to 63% of people today say yes, they would definitely go into space if given that opportunity. And I have a copy of one of Dave's books right here. So we've got To Burp or Not to Burp. And I'm going to open 3 poll questions on Slido right now. So if you're on Slido, you should see all 3 of them opening. The first one is about, does food taste differently in space? The second one, should you burp in space? And the third one is about what happens to your legs and arms in space. So those tuning in who have been on Slido, jump on, pop your answers in to those questions, and then we'll get Dave to talk maybe for about 30 seconds or so about each one. And I can see the poll results changing already. We've also taken some questions in advance from the audience. And the number 1 upvoted question so far, Dave, is from Mrs. Caminiti. And they're wondering, when you came back to Earth, how did it feel to be affected by gravity again, to feel the force of gravity?
Oh, well, that's a fantastic question. When you come back to Earth, it doesn't really matter how long you've been in space. The longer you've been in space, the more pronounced the effect, but you feel gravitationally challenged. I actually felt that it was difficult lifting my arm up. And when I picked up my helmet on the middeck of the space shuttle to walk off the space shuttle, I thought somebody put bricks in the bag for my helmet and things because it seemed so heavy. So astronauts, we say we're gravitationally challenged when we return. It takes us roughly 1.5 to 2 times the mission duration to recover. So if you're in space for 6 months, it's going to take you probably 6 to 9 months, in some cases up to a year, to be able to recover from those changes in your muscles and your bone density and things. It's also kind of cool thinking about all the people who want to go to space, and I'm glad to hear the majority of people want to go, because I would go tomorrow if I could go again. And of course, eating in space is an amazing experience, and we eat basically freeze-dried camping food that does taste a little bit different because of all the fluid shifts that take place in our body. Oh, I think you're muted, Joe.
There we go. So Dave, we've got so many groups joining on YouTube. I'm not going to be able to give shout outs to everybody, but a few shout outs to start. Ms. Sparling's got Catherine and Kayla joining her in Ontario. We've got grade 7 and 8 students joining from Ottawa. We've got Mr. Pimentel with some students in Toronto. We've got the Stephen Lewis Secondary School Space Club joining us. We've got someone joining in, Miss Carton from Alaska. More grade 6s in Ottawa. So lots. Oh, homeschool in Michigan. We have tons and tons of groups joining us live today. And let's start off with one of their questions. And the first question I have coming in on YouTube, Dave, is these days you're writing books, but do you spend time traveling to schools, making speeches and things like that?
Well, these days I've been doing virtual school visits because, it's the way we have to do things right now. But I do get around to schools. Sometimes it's a lot easier doing a video event with a school, but certainly in the context of my books, I've been to many schools, usually in Ontario, but it just depends where I'm traveling, to be able to share the story and the passion about what it's like doing science in space.
All right. So Dave, our first poll question that I opened up in the Slido group was about what happens in space. So I asked, what happens to your legs and face in space? And so the options were your face gets bigger, your legs get smaller, in quotes, or both. So 71% of the audience said both. Can you talk a little bit about that and if they're right?
Well, it is both. And, as a doctor, all these changes are taking place in my own body. So I'm kind of diagnosing what's happening to myself. But it turns out going to space is sort of the opposite of being on an airplane going across the country or going between continents. And if you're on an airplane for a long time and you take your shoes off at the beginning of the flight, you get to the end of the flight and it's hard to put your shoes back on. Your feet didn't grow at all. It's just the fluid in your body settled down into your lower extremities. So your feet get a little bit puffy. Well, in space without gravity, it's the total opposite. The fluid that's in your legs shifts to your chest and your face. So you get a really, really puffy face and your legs are really, really thin. We actually call this the puffy face bird leg syndrome because your legs are in fact so small. The other thing that's kind of fun when you're in space without gravity, not only does your face get puffy, your nose gets congested. It feels like you have a cold, and that's why food sometimes tastes quite differently in the first few days when you get to space.
All right, very cool. So I opened the next poll and I can see people answering already about should you burp in space? But while we let the audience answer that, I'm going to take another question. And this one is from a student at Stephen Lewis Secondary School. And they're wondering what went through your head the first time you looked back at Earth from space?
The first time you see the planet, it is such a remarkable experience. I remember it distinctly, my first liftoff on Neurolab in 1998. After the ride to space, this 8.5 minute ride to space, you release the seatbelt, the harness that holds you in place, and you float out of your seat. You're still wearing your spacesuit, but you're floating around on the flight deck of the space shuttle. I turned around and I was looking out the overhead window back at the Earth, this magnificent, beautiful blue oasis of our planet. And you realize that there's just this thin blue layer of the atmosphere, kind of like what you see behind me. That's the only thing that keeps all of us alive here on Earth. And as you orbit the planet every 90 minutes, you understand that in fact our planet's a pretty small place and we have to take care of it for all sorts of different reasons to protect it for future generations. But I remember on my second flight doing my spacewalks when I was riding on the end of the Canadarm, again looking down at the Earth, this amazing planet, but looking past the Earth at this black infinite void of space. And it made me really ruminate on the fact that the Earth is a spectacularly beautiful place.
All right, so I'm just jumping back to that poll. I've closed the burping poll and I've opened the poll for does food taste differently in space? So Dave, I asked the groups, should you burp in space? And I gave them two options, burp away or no, you'll explode. So 80% said burp away, 20% said you'll explode. What can you tell us about that, Dave?
Well, you're not going to explode, so don't worry about that. However, if you are going to burp away, do it at your own risk. And the problem in space is you don't have gravity. So on Earth, because there's gravity, all the food and the liquid in our stomach, it goes to the bottom of our stomach and the air goes to the top of our stomach. So if you feel you need to burp on Earth, it's really air that comes up and you can make all sorts of interesting noises. And generally parents give feedback to their kids about not doing that and things like that. But when you get to space and there's no gravity, then all of a sudden this air fluid level that exists in your stomach on it, it's not there anymore. So if your stomach feels a little bit distended and you feel like you got to burp, it's kind of random what's going to come up. It might be air, and if you're really lucky, it's going to be air, but it could just as easily be your turkey tetrazzini that you had for lunch. And of course, if it's coming up and you don't have something around to put it in, well, you might just swallow it back down. And I know that sounds really gross, but hey, you got to do what you got to do.
All right, fair enough. So as mentioned, the next poll question is open. I can see it being answered already by our online groups. I want to give a few more shout outs. Calgary, Alberta. Let's see. Looks like Julia and Kristen joining us in Toronto as well. We've got Oshawa. We've got more Toronto, St. Thomas. Lots of great groups joining us live. Let's take another question here. So Dave, the next question is about when you're in space. This is from Theodore and Sebastian. Do you have a clearer view? Could you see some of the planets a little bit better?
You do have a clear view when you're in space. In fact, if you like astronomy and you have a telescope, you go out in your backyard. If you're in a major city, the light pollution makes it hard to see all the different stars and different planets and things. But if you go out into the middle of nowhere, into a field in the wilderness and things, you have an opportunity to look up into the sky without that light pollution. It's incredible how many stars you can see in the Milky Way. It's absolutely unbelievable, and all the planets that you can see. Well, of course, in space, we're above the main part of the atmosphere. So we don't have that problem with light pollution and things. We can see unbelievable things when we're out in space, and our images of the stars and the planets, it's so much easier to be able to see them. So it truly is a remarkable perspective.
All right, very cool. So I'm closing the poll about food tasting differently, Dave. 90% say absolutely yes, food will taste differently in space. 10% no. So it's hard to trick our groups today. Dave, what do you have to say about food tasting differently in space?
Yeah, it does taste differently in space, in part because of all those fluid changes that take place. And every astronaut will give you a different perspective on all this. But for me, I found my preferences for food actually changed when I was in space. On Earth, I'm not necessarily a big mac and cheese kind of person, but on my first space flight, for whatever reason, I developed this craving for mac and cheese. It was fantastic. So I was having it pretty frequently. And it's interesting, how you prepare food in space. We're looking for food that's easy to prepare. It doesn't take a lot of time. There's not a lot of trash associated with it, but it's also highly nutritional and it tastes good. Before I did my spacewalks, I used to have caribou jerky. And that was fantastic because beef jerky, caribou jerky, all of this, it's easy to prepare, highly nutritious, had a lot of protein and things, and gave me the energy that I needed to be able to go and do my spacewalk. So food in space, just like it is on Earth, it's a big deal. And we want to make sure that we have a breadth of food choices available. And if you're a great cook on the ground and you're a great cook in space, all of your crewmates are going to love you.
All right, very cool. So Dave, before I jump to our next question that's come in, is there anything you'd like to poll the audience about? Maybe try and throw a curveball at them, a question, and I can pop up another poll.
So I'm interested in how many in the audience want to become an astronaut.
All right. I have a feeling where this is going to go, but let's see what happens. All right, so that question is up. That question should be open. Feel free to answer that question. And we'll go to our next one, Dave. This question was just upvoted to the top here in Slido. And people are wondering, with your background, obviously as an MD, a medical doctor, what will happen if an astronaut gets sick in space? What do we have to do?
Both times I was in space, I was a crew medical officer. And as a physician crew medical officer, I did have to take care of my crewmates. And there's a whole host of things that can happen in space. You can imagine when you're pushing off from one surface and you're kind of floating through a module, it's pretty easy to collide with something, whether your head hits an object or whether your shoulder something. So, we have bruises, we have minor cuts and things. I never had to sew anyone up like I did in the emergency room, but we did have a couple of lacerations in space from people colliding with stuff. But headaches and what we call space motion sickness are actually relatively common when people arrive in space. The organ of balance in your inner ear is challenged by the absence of gravity. So many astronauts feel sick for the first couple of days when they get to space. They're still able to eat in the majority of cases, but we often have to give medications to treat that nausea to make sure that they're able to get things settled down and achieve mission objectives. When we go back to the moon and when we go to Mars, it's going to be really interesting to think about because, of course, the space station, we can always bring somebody back home if they get really sick. I'm not going to be doing surgery on somebody in space. But what about a habitat on the lunar surface? What about a habitat on Mars where it's 3 years to be able to go between the Earth and, it's going to be a 3-year mission, but 6 months to be able to go between the Earth and Mars. Needless to say, in situations like that, we have to prepare the medical capability for the future and think about how we can enhance the ability of crew members to take care of each other no matter what may happen.
All right, absolutely. Some amazing points, Dave. We'll take a quick look at that poll. Looks like 67% say, oh yeah, I want to be an astronaut. They've got 33% rocking the, maybe that's not for me choice. Very cool. So just a reminder to our groups that you can send questions in via the Slido page, or you can send them in via the YouTube chat. We're watching both of them. But let's grab another one here. This one's from the YouTube chat. And we have, oh, where did it go? I had it pulled up. Oh, here we go. We have this one.
Truck driving down a dirt road, at 40 miles an hour, 30 miles an hour, so bouncing around, everything shaking. And then after the solid rocket boosters separate around 2 minutes into the flight, then all of a sudden it's really smooth. It's like going from the dirt road onto a paved highway, and the remainder of the ride to space is really smooth, but the G forces build up in that last minute or so, 2 minutes before main engine cutoff. You feel almost 3 times the force of gravity. It's like an elephant sitting on your chest. Hard to take a deep breath. I remember my arm fell down to one side. I had to literally pick it up and pull it back to be able to get it back in front of me. And that really is the most dramatic part of the whole ride to space. And as soon as the main engine's cut off, you're thrown forward against your harness and your arms are floating up freely. The checklists are floating freely in front of you. Truly the ride of a lifetime.
All right. Very cool. All right. Well, let's grab another question here. So we'll go back to our Slido group and see what we see. So the next question we have for you, Dave, here we go, is, okay, so we've got Abby joining us. She goes to school at Huntington Park. Having lived in both space and underwater, what are some similarities? What are some differences?
So space and underwater are both extreme harsh environments, and we're very dependent upon technology to be able to live. In space, we're in our spacecraft or aboard the space station. Underwater, we're living on the Aquarius undersea research habitat. And both of these living environments protect us against those extreme environments. Both are spectacularly beautiful. In space, we look out the window at the Earth going beneath us and orbiting the planet every 90 minutes. The view continuously changes. Underwater, we look out what's called the viewing port. It's essentially a window at all the fish. And the fish swim over to the viewing port. They're looking in at us. And it makes you wonder who's in the aquarium here, because all the fish are staring at us like we're in an aquarium looking out at them. It's pretty funny. And of course, underwater, you get a chance to see the sunrise and the sunset, just like you do in space. But in space, you see a sunrise and a sunset every 45 minutes. When you live underwater, it's the same as it is normally. The sun rises once a day and sets once a day. But it's neat seeing it through the water column. And I remember going out and doing a dawn dive where we go out early in the morning, let's say 6:30 in the morning before the sun's come up and the water is totally black and we have flashlights to be able to see where we're going. You go down to the bottom of the reef and you lie in the sand and you just look up. And it's amazing because there's the biophosphorescent plankton that are kind of swimming around you and things. And then all of a sudden, the blackness of the water gets a little bit less black. And then all of a sudden it's a deep purple, a lighter purple, a deeper blue, and then a light blue, and the sun comes up and the rays of the sun are coming down through the water. It's absolutely spectacular to be able to see. The biggest difference between the two environments, underwater, you have neighbors. All of a sudden the fish and the residents of the reef, they're your neighbors, and you go outside, you're swimming around with them, and some of the fish are really quite sociable and some are a little bit antisocial.
All right, very cool. So another question that just got upvoted pretty high on Slido is from Nico. And they're wondering if you were to go on another space mission and could bring something from Earth with you, what would it be?
Well, on both of my space flights, I bought many things from Earth with me. On my first space flight, I had some memorabilia from Wales because my father was born in Bargoed in just outside of Cardiff in Wales. So we had Gareth Edwards' rugby cap. I had a Welsh flag and things. I took the patch from McGill University into space because I spent 12 years at McGill. But I think more importantly, what was really fun is I took my wife's wings. She's a pilot with Air Canada, and I flew her wings in space on my first space flight. Those were her first officer wings. Now she's a captain flying 787s. And on my second space flight, I flew her captain wings in space. And of course, you fly pictures of your kids and your family because you want them to be able to be there with you. And it's important to be able to, look back and have that memory of your family while you're in space. But more importantly, take a picture of you with a picture of your family floating beside you. And that's something that I'll cherish forever.
All right, very cool. So, Dave, there's a lot of movies about space, especially recently. So you've got Ad Astra, Gravity, The Martian, Star Trek. So Pamela is wondering if seeing any of those movies ever makes you nervous, And I'm going to add to that. What space movie you've seen recently that you thought was pretty well done, pretty realistic?
So Apollo 13 is very realistic and I think was very well done. There are many, celebrating the Apollo 11 lunar landing that are also really well done. And the footage in there is just absolutely fantastic. I enjoy the kind of documentary, historically accurate space films, but I think also those space films that tantalize us with the future, what might happen, like The Martian and Ad Astra, they're kind of exciting to think about because if I look back to the 1960s, and I actually remember watching Lost in Space before Star Trek came out. And of course, Star Trek preceded Star Wars, and we can take a poll and see how many people are Trekkians and how many people like Star Wars better. But what we really do in the space program is we take science fiction and we make that science fact. So if we look at some of these more fictional space movies of today and think about maybe in 50 years, maybe in 100 years, we'll be able to do what we see in those movies today as science fiction that will become reality in the future. And that's really cool.
All right. Well, we'll grab a few more questions before we have to wrap up today. We've got Jack joining us. Jack is 10, and Jack says he wants to be an astrophysicist when he grows up. So, Dave, what kind of advice do you have for someone who wants to pursue a career in space, whether it's an astronaut like yourself, or maybe something behind the scenes like an engineer or a scientist, someone who makes some of these missions happen?
We talk about that in my second book, Go for Liftoff. And although it's entitled Train Like an Astronaut, it's really advice for anybody who wants to follow their dreams. And, sometimes people joke about dreams and they say, oh, that sounds kind of crazy, especially adults. You can't have a dream come true if you don't have a dream to start with. And, I was told my dream of becoming an astronaut would never happen because in that time period, it seemed factually accurate that Canada did not have a human space program, so we'd never have a chance to fly in space. Things change. And I think the important element about dreams is don't let other people define your dreams for you. You find your dreams, the things that make you excited, the things you're passionate about, and just go for it. Go for it with everything you have. And if you're truly passionate about your dream, you're going to love working on it, whether it's studying, whether it's reading about it, whatever the methodology is. It's like when I was learning to scuba dive at age 12, that was a real passion of mine, and just go for it. And sometimes when you're doing something that's pushing the envelope a little bit, you're going to fail. Remember when we all started riding bikes? I don't know about you guys, but I would fall off the bike a fair amount of time. You get back on. So it's what you do when you don't succeed that determines whether you will ultimately succeed. And I know many people who applied to be astronauts, they didn't get in the first time round. Took them a second application, in some cases a third application. When I applied to medical school to become a doctor, I didn't get in the first time around. And I write about that in my book, Defying Limits, because I think life is a journey of ups and downs and twists and turns, but it's holding on to those dreams and believing in yourself, pursuing your goals with passion, resilience, and a commitment to not giving up that really makes a difference.
All right. Awesome. Great advice, Dave. Mrs. Sparling is curious about special toothpaste. Is it true that the toothpaste in space is meant to be swallowed?
You can, yeah. It's up to you. Having toothpaste, first of all, is really important because when you're getting clean, it's really nice to be able to brush your teeth, no matter whether you're in the wilderness, doing wilderness survival, whether you're underwater, whether you're in space, having, the ability to get clean and brush your teeth is really, really important. I tended not to swallow mine. To be honest with you, I would take my face cloth and I'd kind of spit it out in the corner of the face cloth. The important thing, is you have to remember what corner you spit your toothpaste out on, because next time you wash your face, if you get the wrong corner, your toothpaste is all over your face. But you can do with it whatever you will.
All right. So I think this is a good question, Dave. Mrs. Robinson is joining in. She's got some students of hers that are likely joining in as well. So where do you see the future of space exploration going?
I believe that the human species is a spacefaring species. And that's a really interesting thing to think about because if we are a spacefaring species, that means sometime in the next 100 to 200, 500 years or so, maybe in the next millennium, we will see humans living in other planetary bodies in our solar system and potentially having gone farther than that. We just have no idea at this point. But if you buy into the concept that humans are a spacefaring species, and you realize that Canada is a major spacefaring nation, just like the United States, Russia, Japan, and Europe. There are many countries in the world who are spacefaring nations, sending either humans into space or Earth observation satellites, communication satellites, etc. And I think it's an exciting time because now you can fly in space as a government astronaut, but you can also fly in space on a private sector spacecraft, which is really an amazing thing to be able to think about. The next generation of pilots may actually be in a position where they're flying airplanes that fly in the atmosphere, like, my wife does, and other commercial airline pilots. And then they may say, I'm going to bid on the spacecraft, like in Virgin Galactic. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to fly an aircraft that actually goes into space and becomes a spacecraft. And that's truly remarkable, thinking about all these changes that are going to take place in the next 50 to 100 years.
All right. Well, Dave, let's wrap up with two questions here. I'm going to put them together. The first one is from David, and he's wondering what you found the hardest to do in space, maybe like an everyday activity you found really hard. And the second question that I'm going to put in is about water. So we've got a 5th grade student in London who's wondering what it feels like when you drink water in space.
Well, let's start with the water question because, there's different ways to drink water. The official way, you have a drinking bag that you fill up with water and you put a straw into it and you simply drink it down. And that's very much like it would be like drinking anything, whether it's water or juice, through a straw on Earth. But there's also the other way that you can drink water. So one way to do it is you take your drinking bag, you squeeze it, and you release this little blob of water that kind of floats around you as a perfect sphere. And it stays as a sphere because of the principle of surface tension. But if you happen to have chopsticks available, you can grab onto that sphere of water with the chopsticks, and it'll stick to the chopsticks, and you can eat your water. Instead of drinking it, you stick it in your mouth with chopsticks. If you wanted to, you could float up to a big blob of water with a straw and stick the straw into the blob of water and slurp it all down. Or in fact, you could just try and grab onto it with your mouth and ingest the water that way. So yes, it's true, we can play with water in space, but I have an experiment I think would be really incredible to do. Nobody's ever done this before, and I don't think anybody will have a chance to do it. But you release a big blob of water and you take a goldfish and you put it in the blob of water, and it's swimming around in this blob of water in space, but there's no glass walls to this aquarium. Is it going to get its nose to the edge and realize that there's no water out there and I don't want to swim through? Or is it just going to swim right through the edge of the water into the air and flop around and say, hey, what happened to my water? Nobody really knows, It's incredible. What was the first question again, Joe?
An everyday activity, something that you found harder to do in space. What was really hard for you?
Yeah, when you first get to space, just getting around actually is something that you have to learn. If you have a video camera and you watch astronauts, when they first arrive in space, they still get around in the spacecraft with the same reference frame that they would on Earth. So the ceiling's the ceiling, the floor is the floor, the walls are the wall. But after you've been in space for a few days and in some cases a few weeks, you realize that you can live and work on any surface. So you have one person sitting upside down having breakfast, talking to another person who's oriented in a totally opposite manner, who's eating their food as well. It's kind of strange, instead of sitting around a table, being at this kind of virtual eating environment where people are floating in all sorts of different orientations. So it's just learning how to be graceful in that environment. And that's critically important when you're doing spacewalks and you're wearing this big, bulky spacesuit with mitts that are essentially the equivalent of hockey mitts, and you're outside the space station trying to repair the space station or install components. It's really a learned skill that takes a lot of practice.
All right, a 360 eating environment. That sounds pretty cool. Well, first of all, I want to give a huge shout out to our live groups. Thank you so much for tuning in today. Thanks for sending in your great questions. And thanks for playing around with Slido with us today. It's the first event that we tested it out in, and we're going to start using it in more events. I think it's a real fun way to interact a little bit more. We'll do some quizzes, some polls, and fun things like that, and upvote our questions. And Dave, what a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us today. Thanks for sharing that awesome presentation and answering some questions, particularly about burping and other things. Thank you so much for being with us today. And we look forward to hopefully another event, maybe in the next week or two. It'll be fun to hang out again.
Yeah, well, thanks very much, Joe. It's been a real pleasure being with you. And, now that we all have time on our hands, if people are interested in reading the books, you can order them online from Indigo, Amazon, wherever you want. But Canadian Warplane Heritage, the museum in Hamilton that's online, has signed copies. If you want autographed copies, you can order those as well. It's been a real pleasure being here. Great questions. Really enjoyed it and looking forward to the next time.
All right. Well, once again, thanks everyone for tuning in with us today. We look forward to seeing you on more Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants events. But for now, we are going to sign off. Thanks, everyone.
Bye bye, everyone.